Hi guys, so today we're going to be talking about religious violence regarding to Eric Rudolph, the domestic terrorist.
My name is McKenna Carbon.
And my name is Georgia Weeks.
So, where do we first learn about him? I first learned about him through my parents. Eric Rudolph became infamous during the 1996 Olympics, which my parents always watched the Olympics. So, I've just grown up learning about him.
I learned about him from this class during the midterm review. You talked about him, so it made me want to research him. Oh, background and summary. He was born September 19th, 1966, where he spent most of his youth in the North Carolina forests. As she mentioned before, he is most infamous for the bombing of the Atlanta Olympics on July 27th, 1996, where he planted a 40-pound pipe bomb, which injured one person, Alice Hawthorne, who was visiting with her daughter to watch the Olympics, and it also injured 100 other people. He was a Christian fundamentalist with anti-abortion views, which led to him bombing two abortion clinics, the first of which was on January 16th, 1997, where he bombed an abortion clinic in Atlanta, which injured 7 people.
So he also had views of anti homosexuality. So in that same year, he also bombed a lesbian nightclub in Atlanta, injuring 4 people. And a year later is when he bombed his second women's health clinic in Alabama, actually killing one security guard and severely injuring a nurse. There was nails that were found to be used in the bomb as shrapnel as well. He then stole 6 months of supplies and went out into the Appalachian Mountains and evaded the police for 5 years. He was finally caught in 2023 and he pleaded guilty and released an 11-page explanation statement. So, some of the central themes that are really common with Eric Rudolph and that we see in this class a lot, the first one being dogmatism. So, dogmatism is when someone only adheres to specific interpretations of religious texts without considering it as a whole or considering alternative perspectives and interpretations. And so Rudolph claims that God supported these bombings because he followed certain scripts and certain concepts, but he only followed those certain scripts and certain concepts and didn't take everything into a whole. And this kind of leads into my next two themes that kind of go hand in hand, and that is uh, to the doctrinal adherence and the resistance to modernity. Rudolph felt that society was straying away from principles and tradition, and instead of keeping up with the times and what's socially acceptable, he decided just to blame everyone else for what he thought was a threat, since they were starting to drift away from the fundamentals of Christian belief.
So that kind of leads into my point of marginalization, which you see a lot in class. And with him, he felt marginalized by the views of global socialism that the Olympics were trying to promote. And they used this song by John Lennon, Imagine, which calls for a world without religion, which I think was a trigger for him. So that was one of his main motives for the bombing, was to stop that marginalization, which kind of ties into my next point, being defensive action, which is an action to defend religious culture and identity, which is seemingly under attack. So for Rudolph, that was what the bombings were for him. And she talked about this a little bit, but the backing from a religious text, where we see really extreme people like this using this religious text as a backing and like kind of a moral out for their violent actions. And he did believe that the bombings were supported by God. Similarities to other instances of religious violence. So I thought it would be good to compare a certain event, and I chose the Osama bin Laden and the 9/11 attacks. And the key similarity that I found was the audience. We talked about this a bit in class, but for terrorism to be effective, there needs to be an audience. And without an audience, there is no terrorism. So you can see in both of these events, whether it's the audience of the Olympics or just everyone, involved in 9/11, there's a large scale audience for both of these events, making them so, if, like, from their perspective, effective.
Yeah, so since Georgia kind of chose an event, I thought I'd go down the route of choosing an individual that was more kind of closely related to Eric Rudolph. And so I stumbled upon Anders Bering Breivik, and he was a far right extremist. who was responsible for the 2011 Norway two-part terrorist attacks. And the first part of the terrorist attack involved Breivik detonating a bomb near government buildings and even the prime minister's office. This killed around 8 people. And the second part was the mass shooting at a Norwegian Labour Party youth camp in Udoa. He was able to sneak on the island and he killed 69 people, most of them being young adults and teenagers. So some of his motives were rooted in his extreme right-wing and anti-Islamic ideology. He expressed anti-immigrant and Islamophobic views, as well as a belief in the need to resist what he saw as the Islamization of Europe. So just kind of like Eric Rudolph, obviously, they both just weren't really happy with the new waves of religion rolling into their own country, and they were happy with just like these new socially acceptable trends, and they just wanted to they just felt that people were reverting from tradition um and just not upholding what used to be like true. So some of the differences from other instances of religious violence.
I thought just to keep it consistent, I would construct or contrast the 9/11 attacks. So the key difference that I think there is the intentional harm to innocent people. Rudolph actually claims in his 11-page statement that he did not mean to hurt people. As I mentioned before, the goal of the games was to force the cancellation, or his goal was to force the cancellation of the games just because he didn't like the ideas that they were promoting. He actually called 9/11 twice to give a warning about the bomb, whereas in 9/11 the attacks kind of required the deaths of innocent people.
So I also chose to highlight Osama bin Laden, but I did it more through the route of just differences in terrorism. So, Eric Rudolph was a domestic terrorist. He attacked his own country, his own people, and inflicted pain. Um, and sometimes that actually resulted in fatalities, all just to further his political and ideological goals. And he also targeted specific groups, such as, that's why he targeted the nightclub and the women's health clinics. Whereas Osama bin Laden, he was an international terrorist. He was born in Saudi Arabia, and he developed a strong anti-Western and anti-American sentiment, so just America as a whole. And he viewed the presence of Western forces in Muslim countries as a threat to Islam.
So what does the future look like? For Eric Rudolph, he's serving 4 life sentences with no parole, and just because he's behind bars, that doesn't mean that there isn't a threat for future acts of violence. It's still very present. Events like the Olympics with large attendances will still always attract terrorism, but there is now more awareness of terrorism in the United States, and specifically the Olympics have definitely adapted to bring more safety and security to both athletes and people in attendance.
Yeah, so domestic terrorism is still alive and well. And actually, a recent article that was released earlier this year by the GAO, which is the US Government Accountability Office, stated that 42 out of 50 states have experienced at least one incident of domestic terrorism between 2010 and 2021. And if we just take into account that statistic, that's a crazy statistic. That is almost 90% of the United States witnessing or going through a domestic terrorism. So just as long as people are able to use religious rhetoric to justify their actions or acts of domestic terrorism and religious violence as a whole, this will just continue to rage on. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're excited. Thank you.